So welcome everybody to Parallax Podcast. My name is Andrew Sweeney and I'm with Jonathan Pageau. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's an icon carver. He makes beautiful stuff, beautiful merchandise, beautiful, traditional icons, all kinds of beauty seems to be in your realm. And you're also host of the Symbolic World. And I think you're educating a lot of us about tradition and about symbols and about meaning and about the patterns of the world. So I want to ask you about traditionalism, because I struggle with traditionalism. I have a love-hate kind of relationship with traditionalism, and so I want to know, like why is tradition so important? Why is orthodoxy so important? And what, and why are we so blind in the modern world to symbols and how can we become symbolically literate? Perhaps is my question.
Yeah, I think that the idea of tradition, or at least understanding what tradition is and what its importance is, it's to understand that we are in a continuation of those who were there before us. And we how can I say this? That we receive something from them. And sometimes we think of receiving as we receive information, but ultimately that's not really what tradition is. Tradition is almost like you receive a way of perceiving quality or perceiving, it's almost like you receive an invisible worldview, something like that. And so I think that that's really what tradition has to offer, which is most valuable, rather than just a bunch of rituals or a bunch of texts or a bunch of
whereas so it's the invisible spirit rather than the manifestation or the outward manifestation of that which is carried through, let's say, the icons and the
well, ends up being both. And so you can't, let's say the spirit will get transmitted subtly, and then the more embodied versions will be transmitted more materially, where the embodied versions also become like a ladder, you could say, for people to be able to perceive what it is that's behind it. Because it's hard to, you can't, when you point to invisible things, you're pointing. And so it's hard to see them. You have to kind of slowly grasp them through analogy, through this experiential knowledge, that finally you start to understand what it's about. But so it kind of has both at the same time. It has there's an invisible, in the Orthodox Church, they talk about the phronema, the idea of the mind. They say you have the mind of the fathers, is what often people will say, which is that it's not only about knowing the texts and quoting the fathers, but it's really about having the same vision or the same way of looking. Or
so it's a transmission. Is that would that be a good word for it?
Yeah. So the idea of that's what tradition means. It really means transmission. And so it is initiatory ultimately, which is why most traditions manifest themselves through some kind of ritual initiation as well. It's not just, there is a sense in which you also kind of have to enter into the world through certain steps, a mixture of ritual and teaching, let's say, both together. You start to kind of get what it's about. So that's why I think tradition is important. And we can talk about the idea. One of the things that happened, obviously, in the late Middle Ages and moving into the modern world has been a tendency to ignore the worldview, or to not completely understand how the world is held together by a kind of network of beings or a network of influences, and starting to see the world as just a mechanical causation, slowly moving towards that. And then that kind of approach to reality led to all the modern wonders that we have, technology and science and everything. But it also evacuated a lot of the wisdom and the cohesion of our society. And so as we watch society break apart, as we're kind of noticing fragmentation, fault lines between different groups, between different ethnic groups, economic groups, we see them growing and we don't know how to resolve them, then I think that looking back to finding a common vision as much as possible is a way in which we can at least find some strength in that, find some kind of cohesion in that breakdown.
Yeah. So look, you said looking back. So this would mean that there's an original pattern to existence, which we seem to have lost, right? And this is perhaps best expressed in the traditions because they embody that pattern.
And so we don't lose it. What we end up doing is what seems like losing it is actually just moving to the fringe of the pattern. And so, if you imagine the basic pattern is something like a wheel or something like a mountain. And as you move away from the center, as you move away from the top, you get into particularity. And that particularity can kind of have its own fascination. And you can forget the origin. Like you can forget the center. You can forget the axis of the wheel as you move further away. As you move, like a wheel is a good example, because as you move further from the center, the center is further and the spokes are further from each other. And so it looks like all these spokes really have a strong existence on their own. And so it looks like the world is fragmenting. But ultimately, if you remember the center, then you realize how they're all connected. And I think that that's the place where we are now, is that the reason why we don't understand what this is about is that we focus so much on particularity and on physical manifestation so much that we've forgotten how things are connected. And so it's not that the pattern goes away. The pattern can't really go away. It's just that there's an aspect of the pattern which is unpleasant, which is this kind of descent into death,
hell,
let's say. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, well, I was thinking about how you've talked about Christianity as being having having this pattern built within it. So the actual death of Christ is, is actually the death of the culture, but there's also a rebirth in a sense, always in that story.
I think that there's definitely, I think that we're seeing, it seems like Christ kind of set up a pattern, let's say inaugurated something which is scaling up. And that right now, let's say all of Christianity is kind of going through a death. And Christ he said it, like he prophesied it. He told us, when the Son of Man returns, will there be faith in the world? And this idea also that the days will be cut short, or else, if not, then there will be nothing left, And so there's a sense in which there was already this notion that this was going to happen. And so
does this happen through cycles, or it's like, because it seems like there's still a billion Christians in the world, and there's Christians everywhere in Korea and Japan, and so Christianity hasn't really disappeared or gone away. Maybe it needs to find its vitality again. Because a lot of the Protestant churches that you go to, you don't feel that there's a spiritual presence there. You feel that it's just a building or
a social club.
I'm sorry to insult our Protestant friends here. But,
well, it seems like, I think that an interesting way to maybe think about it is as a kind of exteriorization. It's as if Christianity seems to, like, if you look at the first cycle, obviously Christ was a Jew and all the apostles were Jews and the early Christians were Jews. But then, 500 years later, that was not the case anymore. There was a kind of death. Let's say Jerusalem was destroyed and the Christians were persecuted. The seeds were planted, and then there was like a movement towards Rome, towards the outside, let's say. And it's possible that this is also what's happening here as well, is that as Europe, let's say European culture, whether in Europe proper or in the Americas, becomes kind of tosses Christianity to the side, that it's actually moving out, and like Africa is becoming massively Christian, and China and South America, there are places in South America where there are these massive Christian movements. So that is also possible that would also make sense to me, at least in terms of a pattern, that is what's happening.
Yeah. I'm wondering, sometimes I hear you talk about the West and the West and the Christian story being the West. And, I became a Buddhist when I was 20, and I know that Jesus went to the East. And actually, I've been reading stuff about the founder of Tantric Buddhism, as actually, he was a Persian refugee, maybe, Padmasambhava. And there were times, I think, when with the Silk Road, where all of these different traditions were sort of mixing and kind of had communication with each other and were talking with each other. And kind of, I like that vision, although I understand the danger of just endless fragmentation, and that you have to, stay with your tradition. So
but there's definitely, what your intuition about the East is not wrong. It's completely right. The idea of, for example, if you look at even in the times of the Neoplatonists, what is it? Plotinus had a plan to go visit the naked philosophers, right? To visit the Brahmin. And so you have a sense in which this connection is still there. And you see it in the European Middle Ages, through the legends of Alexander. The notion of the naked philosophers of the East remains. There is always this idea that there are these wise priests that are somewhere out there. Like, they didn't totally understand the geography of it, but they knew that there was this wise, these wise men, these religious wise men who were out there, and you could go and visit and get some insight from them. And so I think that the connection was always there. You get it also in the stories of Prester John, the idea of this like mysterious Christian figure that's out there in the East that's connected with the Mongols. Like these groups were always, people were always connected. There was always discussion and communication going in several directions. And I think you're right.
But then why would you insist on this being a Western story? Because there's lots of Korean Christians, and there's a bunch of California Buddhists, and it seems like the world is moving, into multiplicity, whether we like it or not. Can we go back to any kind of Orthodox Christian culture? Is that possible? I mean, and this is not a critique of the Orthodoxy or any of the Christian traditions. It's just, that's the question I always have with you.
Well, there are two things to say about that. One is that Christianity is universal, obviously, in its proposition. So, and when I talk about it's the story of the West, I don't mean that it's just the story of the West, but certainly it's the story of the West. That is, the story of the West is the Christian story. From moving from Troy to Rome into this Christian vision, and this Christian idea that they colonizing the northern people and then moving out, kind of spreading out and opening up the idea of European identity. And so it's definitely, that's what it is. And so, but it doesn't mean that Christianity is only that. There's a ancient Christian church in Ethiopia, which has very little to do with the West. There's a Christian church in Armenia that has a little more to do with the West, but not as much. And the same with in India, the Church of Thomas, that it just continued to exist all through these millennia. And so I don't think that, but I mean, I am not that's not what I am. I'm not an Ethiopian. I have great sympathy for Ethiopian culture. I'm not an Ethiopian. Same for the Malankara Church. All of these things I can have sympathy for, but that's not who I am. And so I understand my participation in a story, and I want to help people reawaken to that possibility of participation. And so it's also not like a cut and dry thing, but it is an organic reality, which is that, the story of Quebec is a Christian story. And so we could try to evacuate that, but then you end up with a strange
there was also the First Nation people here. I don't want to be politically correct or anything, but
but I'm not a First Nations person.
Right.
And so there's a connection between the Christian story of Quebec, let's say, there is a connection with Native Americans, and there's scandal there. There are horrible things that Christians have done. But like I've often said this, I don't want to throw that off. I want to remember the good things and the bad things that Christians have done, and kind of embody it in a real way, and go through, because once you understand that scandal is part of every culture, that it's not the quality of one culture to be evil and another culture to be good, then all of a sudden you can take on the sins of your culture and then also take on the good of your culture and say, I'm going to move forward as a French Canadian person with all the, with that kind of tradition. And then, but there's idiosyncrasy in there as well. Obviously my ancestors weren't Orthodox, they were Catholic. And so there is idiosyncrasy there too. But it's really about, it's like, how can I say this? It's about just the possibility of really living something. And so what I see, like, let's take the example of people who become Hindu. Like I know friends who say they become Hindu, but it's like, I don't see how that's really completely possible. I mean, it seems like, and when you talk to them, it's like, or like people who become like druids, like these, like Wicca, for example.
Sure.
Like it's made up. It's all made up stuff.
Hindus didn't really exist, did they? They were named by the British Empire. There was all kinds.
Yeah,
of
there are different cults and different structures, and whether you worship these different gods and different practices. So it's not at all. It ends up being like a kind of delusion, let's say, that people give themselves. The same with the whole neo-pagan things and the Druids. Like it's all made up. It's all this kind of weird made up.
I agree with that. I think that a lot of these traditions are fragmented, and people are catching like parts of them, and kind of trying to. It's like patchwork. They're trying to
like a Frankenstein religion. Put
on some kind of get involved in some kind of middle age alchemy and mix it up with a few Hindu things and. Yeah, I agree with that. But I think there are other traditions in Christianity that are whole and complete, and that you could become a Buddhist. You could become I actually like, even if you were a Western person, I mean, why couldn't you?
Well, it's mostly why would you? I mean, I
can tell you why I did.
I understand.
It was because I didn't meet Saint Francis.
You're right. I agree.
I met some really amazing people who are Zen, who dedicated their life to that and had an ambiance of spiritual realization. And I wanted to be like that and do that. It was simple for me. And,
No, but I understand also in facing like you said, the kind of the vacuousness of modern Christianity. I have a lot of sympathy for people who say, I'm going to look elsewhere. I have to admit, in my 20s, I had the same movement, let's say, to kind of read Sufi texts and to read Gnostic texts because I felt like there was a vacuousness in terms of the, let's say, the cosmic vision of what I was involved in terms of Christianity. But then maybe I had the chance or the fortune to find the ancient fathers and to realize that it was all there, like it was just all there in St. Gregory of Nyssa.
So you were looking for this esoteric, I mean, the real mystical heart of the tradition, I think. Which is often lacking in the exoteric and just the people going through the motions, or which was probably more present in the Orthodox tradition than maybe others. Or
for sure in the Orthodox tradition, you don't get it seems like, at least in the West, the kind of exoteric difference, which seems to come from I don't know exactly where it comes from. Maybe it comes from Islam or something. But this idea of like exoteric idea came as the Christian form seems to become so diluted that they didn't have that. They didn't have that to which the mystery seemed to point to. So people started to embrace all these weird, like Rosy Cross kind of esoteric societies, Freemasonry and all that stuff. But in the Orthodox tradition, there's a sense in which if you properly approach communion, it's like, that's the highest mystery. You're not getting a higher mystery than eating the blood and body of the incarnate God. Like that is esoteric, and it's available to all, but it's available to all to the level at which you can engage it. And so there is still, like, for example, like there still is an exoteric difference in Orthodoxy, but it has to do with the catechumen and the initiated. And so during the liturgy, they chase the catechumens out of the church and they close the church. And then the rest of the tradition is supposed to be just for the initiated. They don't chase the catechumen anymore, but it's still there in memory, at least. But then when you come to the communion chalice, like, if you read what the fathers say about it, it's the highest thing. It's the St. Maximus says that it's actually deification. Yeah. That taking communion is deification. If you can handle it, like if you can't handle it, then obviously it won't raise you up in terms of your own consciousness to that level, but that's what it is. So, yeah.
But that's the liturgy and the practice and the intention and the direction, right?
Well, it's like you could imagine, like for someone like let's say Saint Mary of Egypt, who basically spent her whole life in the desert and fasting in this desire for asceticism, and who was so much of a saint that she could walk on water, that she never received communion, like all that time, no communion. And then finally, when she received communion, it's basically like that was it for her. She could die. Like she had reached, for her, it was like she had reached basically the full illumination.
In the Buddhist tradition, there's this idea of Sutra and Tantra. And the Sutrianic tradition is about renunciation. It's about controlling the passions. It's about it's about morality and ethics. It's about being as virtuous as possible. And this is like the first part of Buddhist practice. And then when you enter the tantric tradition, there's this idea of transformation, and the fact that you're using the passions, even anger or whatever, in a transformative mode. And I'm wondering how that. I wonder if there's something like that in Orthodoxy, or if that is a universal pattern as well, which you could probably find in Christianity as well. Or
I would say that it definitely is, but my perception is that they're not separate. Yes. That in Orthodoxy, they're actually joined together. And so the vision, if you read, like, let's say the vision of asceticism, it turns into passion. Like there isn't a sense in which there's a sense in which the monk is dispassionate, but is also completely taken up by passion. But their passion is turned towards the divine and is turned towards God. And so you see that, so you can see that the tantric symbolism is all present in Christianity. I mean, communion is, like I keep saying, there's nothing more tantric than communion, in terms of this kind of bringing in a sense of this limitless and almost transgressive aspect of reality into the holiest place, and then participating in it. But it's also not transgressive, at least not in Christianity. It's also completely a meal, like it's completely a normal meal of communion between people. But there's an aspect of it where we are the bride of Christ. We are in rapture with our lover. Like that, all the passionate language gets taken up into the ascetic practice. So if you read a commentary in the Song of Songs, the description of the relationship between God and the soul is a relationship of passionate love. Yeah. And so this is completely normal. Like it's a completely normal thing. And you get a sense also that all the passions, like they are all images of the good ultimately, but that they have to be kind of transmuted or transformed into their proper, let's say, direction.
Yeah.
So that's also part of it.
That's what attracted me to the tantric tradition in general, is this transmutation aspect. Is that I think trying to be a good person my whole life is bound to failure. So there's one point where you go beyond that, and whatever body, mind, contraption, whatever passions you have, whatever they need to be transformed or transmuted. They're not going to go away. Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense.
But in the tantric tradition, for example, you have to do all kinds of, you do like prostrations, you do thousands of prostrations, and then you to offer your body, and then you do mantra, you offer your mind, and then you do these mandala offerings where you give away everything away. There's this whole sort of process that you go through. I guess liturgy, I don't know if it's the same thing. They would call it sadhana.
Tradition, but in the Christian practice, there's basically one spirituality, like the spirituality of seeing the divine light, which is the repetition of the Jesus prayer with certain breathing practices. And also it seems like, I don't know how to do it, but if you read the text, it seems like they were timing the prayer with their heartbeats. And so, like this practice, but it's also very warm. Or
something in a way. It sounds like
but it's very warm. It's not a technique. Like if you try to paint it as a technique, the fathers will slap you, right? It's a sense that it's very warm, that it is also penitential. Like it's the invocation that you're doing, which is Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, has to also become a true invocation. And so the repentance is part of that. So it's not just like it's not just like a spiritual technique, but it's a warm penitential thing at the same time.
Yes.
And so that's what I mean. This is the thing that people.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you're using the word warmth, because I think that's, if it's not, it's just a technique. It's something that could be used in a modern way to evoke some kind of experiences.
Exactly.
For people who are just looking for experiences, but it's not about that, right?
Yeah. The fathers warn about that all the time. They're always saying, like, first of all, they even say, like, if you're not Orthodox, you shouldn't do this prayer. And if you don't have someone kind of guiding you, you shouldn't do it. At least not in the way that fathers would do it, because they would try to do it nonstop. Like, they would just try to have that prayer running in the background of their existence, where they would just say it without stopping. And so they say, don't do that. You go crazy. If you do that, you'll just lose your mind. If you do it without guidance and without the proper attitude, because it can also lead to spiritual delusion. People have these experiences and then they think that this is it, like they've reached it. And so, like, this to me, like, I have to be honest, like, this to me, like, when I meet most of the people, like, I can't say for all of them, but most of the people that I've met who are into, let's say, Tantra and yoga, they're all into it to me, in my opinion, for the wrong reasons, for the opposite reasons of what it seems that the tradition is there for. They're they seem to, a lot of people that are into Tantra that I know seem to be in it to have the best sex life possible.
Oh yeah.
They seem to be in it to, like, have really high experiences. That's
because, like, that's called neo tantra. It's new tantra, and it's people wanting sex, and it's not really what tantra is. Originally, tantra is about making the thread to the divine. I mean, and it's about working with a teacher, and it's So I mean, you're right to make that criticism. Chogyam Trungpa called that spiritual materialism. Which and
the yoga seems, the way that yoga is presented in the West, at least, that seems to be what it is. It's like people do this and it's just about being healthy. It's like, the idea that the purpose is to be healthy.
It's a pretty lame spiritual purpose, a pretty lame direction. Oh, I can be healthy and happy, and oh, come on,
and stretch, be stretchy and have spiritual experiences at the same time. So it's all good.
That made me think of Jordan Peterson, who wants to bring in, carrying your cross and the seriousness and the gravity, right, of the spirit of the spiritual path in some sense. Even though he never, he's never became part of a spiritual organization, or he seems to be still on the outside of that. And I wonder, I was listening to your recent conversation with Jordan Peterson, and I was wondering why does he resist so much joining an organization or just saying I believe in God? Why does it have to be? Why does it have to be I act like I believe in God? And what's the difference? Is there a difference? I mean, if you act like you believe in God, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a belief. I mean, it's a belief. I guess there's a stage where you're living God, and that's something different. But anyway, I'd like to hear your insights or your thoughts about
I don't know. Like, I'm not in Jordan's mind. Yes. I'm not in his soul. But I think there are two things. One is that I think he's trying to be very authentic about his own process. He doesn't want to pretend. He wants to really say, well, if I believe this and I believe this, that's one. The second is, I think that he gets the conclusion of what it means to believe in God wrong, which is I mentioned it in the conversation. He seems to think that the first conclusion to believing in God, or to acting as if you believe in God, is an ethical one. And I don't think so. I think that it's worship, and worship is different. Worship is attention. Worship is a celebratory position. Yeah. And so it has more to do with prayer and worship than it does with, being a good person, because, God is there watching you. That's almost like a weird.
That's of Protestantism, isn't it?
That's what it feels like to me, or like a misunderstood, because Protestants aren't that bad. Like, it's a misunderstood. It seems like to me like a misunderstood kind of Protestantism. And so there's that. And then I think also I don't think he wants to be in a hierarchy, because that implies a lot of stuff. Uh-huh. Like, imagine you're like a teacher. You're almost like you're basically like a spiritual guru, but he's not that, but he's almost that. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I tell him, you need to join an organization, and then you have an authority.
Yeah.
Because once you do that, like there are some things that if I say, like if I said something completely wild, like I would have a phone call from my bishop, and my bishop would tell me that, no, you can't say that. And I would have to obey if I want to remain Orthodox.
Right.
That's something. It's
so
not,
yeah,
that's
it's
not
just
it's not
obedience that people do. I guess people don't want to be obedient to something.
But I don't think
But
Jordan would like think that out loud, but I think that
No.
there's something about, he's like a cowboy, like his personality,
Yeah.
you know, he has that kind of sacred, what is he, like the idea of the supreme individual,
Or maybe he just hasn't. Yeah. Well, he just hasn't met a teacher yet. I wonder if you have to meet a teacher who you can actually follow, or a person who embodies that. And he hasn't met that person yet who would get him in that process. So he has to do it all by himself, right? On some level.
That's possible. Like he might need to meet a saint of some kind. Like they exist, you know. They're hard. They're not a lot of them, but there are some.
No, I think so too. You know. Yeah, that's. I mean, I think I think there's something about what he's doing that he's actually revivifying, you know, people's interest in spirituality, which is there's a strange paradox there.
I agree. That, I mean, I think that it's not spirituality. I would say like everybody's interested in.
Well, that's an ugly word. Well, religion, then we can say
religion is a dirty word. That's why I think he uses that word. He uses the word religion because it gets people turned off right away.
Yeah.
So he says, even though he's not really a religious person, but he'll say something like I'm deeply religious, which turns people off because it implies, you know, all kinds of things. It
implies the obedience, isn't that like what you were talking about? You have to be obedient to some higher principle than yourself, and that's like why a tradition. Spirituality is, in this California sense, is much more easier or softer or appealing to people who are not courageous.
Yeah, it really is a kind of psychological version of I do it makes me feel good, pretty much. I would say it's psychological more than it is spiritual in the specific sense, but it's like I do things like I meditate, I do these things that make me feel good, make me healthy, you know, basically. It's funny because when you read the saints in like every tradition, they'll like destroy themselves. They will destroy themselves to be in communion with the divine. They'll do anything, you know? Yeah, and so they don't have the idea of being healthy. They're like, I'll destroy all my body if I need to.
Yeah, I was reading.
I mean, not that you have to, but
Arena Tweeny was working with the Sufi master, and you know, basically it's a breakdown of the personality. A total breakdown of the personality is like the first step, and then there's another 100 forms of torture, you know, before you get to the you know, you get to the place. So it's very intense.
Yeah, you can when you read the monks in the Egyptian desert and these monasteries that got set up in the Egyptian desert, and as a modern person, like I find it unbearable. Like I read that stuff and I think of what the abbot was doing to the monks, and he would really like find the thing that the monk doesn't like, let's say, and then he would just like, you know, push his finger there to say like, this is your weak spot. I'm gonna just like, oh man, I don't think I could do it. I would drive me nuts. Like I'm too much of I wish I wasn't, but I'm too much of an individualist. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, that's the point. I think maybe is that genuine religion practice is a challenge. It's an affront, and it's full of joys as well. But it's can never be sugar coated. I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, people think that meditation is about relaxing and being calm, and I'm sorry, but that's total bullshit. You know, go to a Zen monastery in Japan and see what that's like. And you wake up at 2:30 in the morning and you go in a cold room and you meditate in the dark for 4 hours, and somebody comes by and beats you with a stick, you know. And then you go and meet the Zen master and he kicks your ass a little bit. And that happens for 10 years, and then after that, you might learn something. That's how it kind of works, really. That's not like being Zen, being calm, being relaxed, having a nice aesthetic around you. And whatever people think Zen is just totally ridiculous.
Having Buddhist statues in spas, like
well, there you go. Yeah.
That's pretty much what that's my vision of Western like Buddhism. It's like and that's why I always joke, and I'm not totally joking when I say my Catholic grandmother was more of a Buddhist than a lot of the Buddhists that I meet, let's say, in like every day, in this world right now. When people just kind of randomly say, well, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm like, really? Interesting.
Yeah, well, I could introduce you to a few people,
to a few real Buddhists,
to a few real Buddhists, including my own teacher, who's very fierce and challenging, and would probably kick your ass, Jonathan, if you made a mistake. So, but he would love you too.
He would love me and kick my ass.
Yes. Okay, so one question I just had written down here that just popped up is like, so. Are things getting better or are they getting worse in the world?
In the world?
Everywhere. Like what's happening?
Yeah.
Are we like the traditionalist views kind of like, I guess the traditionalist schools with Rene Guénon and all those guys, they seem to think we're headed, just modernity is endless fragmentation leading to death and fragmentation. And it's just cycling into this, we're in the Kali Yuga, and it's another 1,000 years of darkness, and there's, and then a new cycle will begin. But
I do think
we're kind of fucked.
Yeah,
excuse my language.
So it's interesting. Like I've been thinking about this a lot because I think that my natural tendency is to think that way. Like not the Kali Yuga stuff, but to think that things are getting worse and that we're moving towards like a total collapse.
Yeah.
But I've had people really challenge me on that, in the sense that, for example, like if you look at Western society, it's kind of losing its values, but it does take care of the poor in a way that no one ever has in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
And so this is an objective truth where the poor are cared for in ways that has never happened. And so, and the same thing is like, we do have a virtue of kindness and a virtue of respect towards the other that is quite strong in our culture, even though we're kind of evacuating the source of that. So there's all these weird things going on. There's a sense in like when Christ, but it definitely is there are some things that are definitely getting worse in terms of, you can see the fragmentation, you can see the breakdown, you can kind of see it coming. And Christ talks about the idea of, the wheat and the tares growing up together. And I think that's probably the best way for me now to understand it, is that there's a sense in which as time moves forward, the wheat is growing and getting ripe, but the tares are among them. And it's hard to completely disentangle them until the reaping, let's say, until the end. And so I think that that's something that we're seeing, is that we're seeing both happen at the same time. And there's like also a sense in which the idea of the last wine, which Christ talks about in different images, not just the image of the wedding of Cana, but there are different images where he talks about the surprise of the last thing being better than which was before. And I think that that's also something which seems to be, it's possible that what's preparing itself is a surprise in that sense, where out of the chaos is actually going to rise up some very powerful jewels, like some pearls are going to appear in these last moments. So
yeah, I was listening to this Jewish rabbi, and in fact, because the Jews are waiting for the Messiah to come, they're this very optimistic about the future. It's like, it's getting better. It's actually where heaven and coming down to earth, and they have this mentality somehow. So I thought that it's definitely there. Like, it's interesting. Because I'm doing this video on the mark of the beast, and I'm doing more videos on Revelation. And so there really is, like in Revelation, these two images that are kind of juxtaposed to each other, which is the beast and the whore together. Let's say the beast and the whore, and then the heavenly Jerusalem. And there's a sense in which, the beast and the whore is like the worst aspect of civilization. Yeah.
And then the heavenly Jerusalem is like the best aspect of civilization, because it says that in the heavenly Jerusalem, all the glories of all the nations will be gathered into the city, which is a beautiful image, a sense that all the good things of all these nations will be gathered into the heavenly Jerusalem. And so it's like that, but those are the two images. It's as if, like you said, those two things are, or like we talked about, those two things are kind of growing up at the same time. And it's sometimes hard to perceive how one is going to become the other, or how one is distinguished from the other, but they're there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a simultaneous heaven and earth happening at the same time, or heaven and hell happening at the same time. Like, people are living pretty well on one level, and then, as you say.
Yeah, but it's also the fact that people are living well is part of the reason why there's a breakdown. Yes. So it's an interesting situation. It's like comfort breeds laziness, obviously, and breeds self-sufficiency. And so people, because we're materially well off or materially comfortable, then we don't attend to the spiritual things. Right. And that's there in the story of the Buddha as well, because he was so comfortable that he could not see the spiritual path. He had to encounter death before he could kind of go on that road. I think that's just a universal story of what it takes, what it takes to kind of push you onto the path,
Which is sort of this meeting of death, as you say. Yeah. So when something like event like COVID happens, I wonder, okay, is this the world falling apart, or is this some sort of like awakening of some kind? Is this, and it's probably both, right?
Well, it's probably for some it's a breakdown completely, and
well,
for
of
others
course,
it could be
for
awakening.
The people who suffer, I didn't mean to be,
but not even though just not the people who suffer. I'm pretty sure that there are many churches that will not get back from this. They just won't. People will just they'll just stay on YouTube and watch videos on YouTube. It's much easier than going to church. And so we've been kind of pushed into that for people. And so I think that a lot of churches won't wake up, and a lot of intermediary organizations, let's say clubs, groups, let's say intermediate identities, won't survive very well after COVID. And so in that sense, it's going to be very bad. But, I think it also provokes some people, like it'll provoke some people to value what they didn't have access to during COVID. Like I'm seeing it a little bit in my parish, which is that COVID pushed us really hard because we were renting a place. And then because of COVID, the people who were renting it, they didn't want to rent it anymore because it was too much trouble with the police and everything. So they just said, no, you have to go. And then we ended up kind of wandering, went to some place, but it was complicated. So like this kind of pain, now it forced people to kind of say, okay, well, we actually need to put effort into this. Like if we want this to survive, you need to gather together and push. And so that's valuable, and hopefully that'll have fruits.
Yeah. Well spoken. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. So I know that I wanted to ask you a bit about your carving and about your vision of art. That was one thing I wanted to ask you about. And again, I'm a huge admirer of all your work. And then sometimes I'm frustrated with the traditionalism and the total denial of the modern. Like I love, like for example, Cézanne's Mountain and things like that. Some things in modern art I think are very beautiful, and there's this immediacy of color and all that, and I feel you're rejecting all of that somehow. So I just want to hear about that a little bit.
You want to hear about me rejecting?
Well, just like arts, like I understand your critique of modern art, and obviously modern art has become the biggest racket that you could possibly imagine. But is it all bad? Is it all,
No, it's not all bad. It's all about hierarchy. Everything's about hierarchy. So my first critique of modern art is a very deep critique. It's actually not a critique of the styles or of the subjects. It's a critique of its very existence. That is, the problem of the art object is my first critique. it's the problem of the idea of creating these objects which are just there, that are just there to look at, let's say, and that don't actually justify their position in the world, don't justify their existence in the world through participation in the life of people. Like the Kantian notion of this kind of pure aesthetics, or this capacity to kind of look at a work of art, like you go to a concert and you just sit there and you listen to music. These are not, this is the basic critique that I have, which is that music in the ancient world was participatory. Like you didn't just play music to listen to it. You would play music to celebrate a birthday, to celebrate a wedding, a king, a funeral, the liturgy, the mass, a dance. All of these things were engaged in the world. And so we've turned music into a private experience. And if a public experience, then an experience of let's all stay quiet and listen to the music and then applaud. So that's the basic critique that I have, even before the styles. Now the styles will go with it, because the styles that got developed were which kind of went in that direction. And so there's an excess in modernism, which is almost like it's like an excess of fetishism in sexuality, which is a very pointed thing, which gives you more pleasure, right? And so there is a reality that is true of what you said. Like looking at a Cézanne or at a painting by Gauguin or Kokoschka or all these artists that really kind of went into this visual play that was extremely pointed, it does end up giving you more pleasure, but that pleasure has a cost, right? It has the cost of participation in reality. Yes, it has the cost of emptiness. And so it's like, so I'm not saying that there's something necessarily wrong with modern art, but ultimately what it would have to be is something like spice, like if you look at a medieval manuscript, I always keep bringing it back to the image, is that in a medieval manuscript, you had the central image, which would be the subject. You'd have an image of Christ or of the scripture, or of an important moment in history, or the coronation of a king, or whatever, like something important in the center. And then in the margins, then you had free reign, and everything is possible. And if you look at the experimentations that you find in medieval manuscript in the borders, they are exactly, you could find all of modernism almost in the borders of a medieval.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Very much so. And you're surprised, because people think they have an idea of what medieval borders are like, but it's because they haven't looked at them. If you start to look at them, you'll realize just how much there is, or the kind of surrealism that existed in church capitals, or in gargoyles, or in these kind of more peripheral imagery. Wow. There was a kind of imagination which was totally let loose, totally let wild. But that's also because it was in its proper place. And so
in its proper place means the margin needs to know it's the margin, and the center needs to know it is the center. We need to know what the margin and the center are.
And it has there's a danger, right? Just like sexual fetishism is dangerous, because what it does is it kind of sucks you in, and then it imprisons you if you're not careful. And then you actually become ruined for. It's kind of like, it's almost like there's something about the excess of quality in a specific thing, which can be dangerous, because it can suck you in. It's like, if you start to drink the best coffee, and like start to like go into finding the best coffee and paying, $100 for this little bag of like special coffee, then be careful what you're doing, because at some point someone will serve you a cup of coffee and it'll taste like mud water. To everybody else, it tastes fine, but for you, it tastes like mud water. And so it's like you've actually ruined yourself. You've ruined yourself through a desire for excessive pleasure. It's like the reality of the monk who would eat just bread. That monk will have more pleasure from eating just bread than at some point you will from drinking your fancy coffee.
Well, almost isn't extreme asceticism almost the same as, like having a ritual orgy or something? I mean, doesn't it bring you back to the center, or a ritual
orgy brings you back to the center?
No, I mean, like there would be,
I can't believe I'm talking about this. All right.
there would be traditions, very obscure traditions, you know, in the Himalayas where that sort of thing would happen. And then people would go back to their lives because and be normal, right?
It's like the carnival.
It's the same thing as starving yourself to death. It's an extreme experience, right, of the margins, which might bring you back to the center.
Well, the asceticism is more about kind of removing the garments, like it's removing the outer shells and moving in towards the center. And so it's kind of like the opposite of the more carnivalesque traditions, let's say. But I obviously Christians didn't have these orgies, but like there was an aspect of carnival which was preserved in Christianity, like a kind of basic, let's say,
so you do once or twice a year, and that would purify you of the sin, maybe that you might.
Or it would just be like a little evacuation of something which is kind of lingering, and also an expression of the border, an expression of the reality of the fringe of the dross, you know, of the leftovers of a system that are that have to be somehow dealt with in order to be able to move on to something else, you know.
Yeah, makes sense.
But so in terms of modern art, let's just say that modern art is something like that. It's something like trying to make the best icing to put on the cake, and then going into that to a point where it becomes so pristine that if you're not like, it's like a delicacy that is such a delicacy that if you can't, most people can't even enjoy it anymore.
You can't enjoy it, right? Like that's why
it's so strange and particular and refined that it's like you look at a giant blue canvas and you don't enjoy it unless you're like someone who was taken by the hand into this weird fetishistic aesthetic all the way to its end, and now you can stand in front of this thing and kind of, you know, it's like it's almost like it's like an inverse initiation. It's almost like an initiation into the margin rather than back into the heart of the world, let's say.
So
but like I said,
your art and your icons and stuff, that the aim is contemplation, right? And the aim is to bring you back into the heart of the world. Would that be right? Definitely.
And also participation. That is, the images that I make are for people, are for churches, are engaged in the story of Christ and his saints and the Gospels. So there's a sense in which I'm embodying the story that I participate in by making these images. And I'm also encountering people in a kind of communion because the client tells me what they want and I'm making it for them. So it is a form of social communion as well, or not just social, but even more than that, like a spiritual communion that I'm engaging with. And so to me, that is a way to let's say undo because it's not nostalgic. This is really important because a lot of people a lot of people dislike the way that contemporary art has gone, and now they want to make painting, but they want to make like 19th century academic painting. But there's a sense in which that's just nostalgia. Like there's no need for that in the world right now, or there's no demand for it. Like my icons, there's a need for them because people still get baptized, because priests still serve liturgy, because it actually does enter into a community in a real way that's not just a pastiche of something in the past.
And I guess you're copying something on one level, but also there is a modern quality to the stuff you're doing. You're using some modern materials, and like you're not just replicating something from the past. There is still something happening that is now, right? Or
well, you can't find the thing. It's almost funny because if you look at my carvings, they look like something which could have been made 1,000 years ago, but they also don't. I mean, you could never, no historian would ever think that my images were made 1,000 years ago, because they're obviously made now. There's many elements, many choices that I make which are not, which will betray, or not betray, but will just show that these images are made now in this world. So like an example is that there's a sense in which right now, because we have access to all these images, there's a kind of confusion, which is possible, like this, Google Images and this kind of surcharge of stimuli, let's say. But there's also, I believe that actually, so the remedy to that is to move towards synthesis. And so one of the things that I'm doing in my work is I will pick what I find to be some of the best practices in different traditions, and then I start to kind of join them together. And so the faces, for example, the faces that I make, they don't look like Byzantine faces. They look more like late Romanesque faces. Not totally. There's a little bit of like, almost like there's a little bit of even more hieratic imagery, let's say like Babylonian, Persian type imagery in my work as well. But then the clothing, for example, I find the Byzantines really did have this like kind of glory of clothing. And so I will tend to look at the Byzantines more for clothing. But when people look at it, I'm not trying to create I'm not at all. And also it's like, I want to be careful so that my work doesn't look like a collage, but that it does have integrity and synthesis. And so for a lot of people that look at it and just say, this looks like something that could have been carved 1,000 years ago. And I love hearing that. I'm grateful because it doesn't at all look like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess if people can sense an ancient quality to what you do, then that's the most powerful art. Probably has that ancient quality. It probably has the quality of freshness in the moment, but also has this ancient quality at the same time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. But what you want is something to feel like home to someone, but not feel like dusty, like the dusty kind of broken down home. You want it to feel like this is home, but this is home now. And so I would say that that's a good approach, is because and I say that very deliberately because a lot of artists, if they examine their intentions, it's specifically to shock, it's specifically to surprise, to engage this titillation of the new, and they do that to get attention, and it works. But that's exactly the type of thing that I try to avoid, because that titillation of the new, that's why you can't stand to look at, shag carpeting anymore. Or that's why you can't stand because it gets old very fast. Yeah. All these churches that were built in the 50s, all these horrible Catholic churches that were all modern now look like monsters. They look like these monstrosities, mutant churches that we can't stand to see anymore. And everybody goes back to the old kind of classical churches in terms of appreciating, let's say.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Is that because there's some kind of sacred geometry behind those buildings, or some sort of understanding of timelessness, rather than just like trying to, as you say, trying to dazzle somebody or shock them or manipulate them in some kind of a way? Yeah. There's a natural, how can I say this? It's almost like almost like an evolutionary process, you could almost say, where there's a sense in which things in tradition have been proposed and kept, proposed and set to the side. Yeah. Some aspects proposed and kept. So there's this kind of sense in which tradition builds on itself by putting its attention on certain aspects of what has been done in order to kind of go forward. Because you can always find weird stuff through all history. There's weird stuff all around, but some things get carried through and some things get left behind. And so that organic process is what gives you the proportionality, like the powerful proportionality of a 19th century village church, which is just made by a bunch of peasants. But when you walk into it, it's like, this has some balance to it. Like it has a natural balance to it. There's just up the road from me, there's this old church that is like one of the oldest in France, and it's just a bunch of stones, right? I mean, it's like, it's beautiful. You don't know why exactly, and it just, and you walk in and you can almost feel the vibration of the place, which is like, I guess that's this. Well, I'm interested about, icons and the idea that you contemplate them too, right? Because again, that's similar to some of the practices I do. You look at an image and you contemplate them and you feel them in your body, and it's not just the eye looking at something. oh, that's really interesting, or that, but there's this fact that you live with an image, and you work with an image, and you contemplate this image, and this image starts to reveal things to you over time. This might be, I don't know, something that's been lost in the modern world, and in which you are bringing back, in a sense.
I hope so. I hope so. There's the image in the Christian tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, has to do with communion as well. It has to do with the sense of memory and image being a way to, let's say, invoke the presence of someone, or to remember not remember in a far away manner, but remember in a presencing, right? It's like you bring into you. And so the saint, like, once again, it's a warm thing in the sense that the image of the saint, it's not just the image, it's the person represented, right? The icon points to the prototype. And so to engage, to have an image of Christ is to remember Christ, and to look at the image, to kind of, yes, the image is kind of the vehicle by which Christ is being brought into communion with you, but it's ultimately kind of looking through towards the prototype. And so there's a sense in which, that's why, like, in Orthodox churches, you'll just have all the saints represented, just dozens and dozens of saints, because it really is this cosmic idea of the sense that we're all praying together. And so when you pray with an icon, there's a sense in which you're engaging, the saint is there with you praying.
Yeah.
That's the movement that is being engaged with.
The traditionalist movement, again, I know that you and your brother were inspired by the traditionalists.
You mean the traditionalists, like, in the
traditionalist
sense of
school,
the perennialists, like Guénon and
René Guénon and Kutswarmi and all these guys, kind of had this amazing, understanding of symbolism, and wrote these incredible books. And yet there seems to be a kind of tendency towards, like, I don't know, Alexander Dugin in Russia, who's kind of a Russian imperialist. I mean, he kind of believes in Russian imperialism on some level, and then there's Julia Evola, who is sort of semi-fascist. And so how do we, when we go into orthodoxy and we go into that, how do we avoid that? I mean, because that seems to be when you talk about revolutionaryism, the margins and stuff, it seems like the orthodoxy of the traditionalist school sometimes goes into this kind of weird revolutionaryism, where it actually is like those people, it becomes the margins or something. Or am I making sense here?
I don't identify at all as a traditionalist, like, in any way. I really don't identify with those people anymore.
Well, I just wanted to know if you had some insight into that for me, because I struggle with it, because I find them so powerful, and at the same time I struggle with how, like, I would say, the world.
Like, let's say the few things I still point to in terms of those people, I think that Guénon's understanding of modernity is a really good, for like a young 20-year-old to read Crisis of the Modern World, I think is a good thing to kind of shatter a lot of the illusions of modernity. And so I think there are a few things they can do. I think Kumaraswamy's book on art, what is it called? Medieval and Eastern Art, that little book that's even published by Dover. I think that little book for artists is has a good capacity to break down the modern delusions of art as well, and to come back to this ancient embodied artistic practice. But like you said, one of the reasons why they seem to become revolutionaries is because they're not traditional in the real sense. The traditionalists, one of the problems with them is that they seem to think that they just, like, stand above religion. And that's the problem, is that Guénon, and they talk as if they're above religion, and that they're looking down, and they're kind of picking and choosing and comparing as if they were just these transcendent, gods. And it gets worse in, like, modern traditionalists. Because modern traditionalists are even doing it almost like a kind of Joseph Campbell scholar style, where they're just like, oh, and this says this in Hinduism, and it says this in this text, and then they're, like, comparing mythologies as if they're, and there's something about that which there's something very pretentious about it, and there's something also which lacks embodiment. And so it can be made instrumental. And that's, I think, what Evola did. And Dugin is an Evolist, really. I've never liked Evola, even from the beginning. I couldn't stand his book. Sorry for anybody who likes it. I just never liked it because he was so political, and I just wasn't interested in that. But so let's say, like, real orthodoxy, or like a Christian orthodoxy, is not perennialist. It's not traditionalist. It's Christian. It's a real Christian tradition, and the thing that it has, that I think that it is more than a lot of what happened in the West, is that it still has all the mystical approach and the idea of theosis, and all of that is very much there. But so, like, I don't think that Dugin tries to instrumentalize orthodoxy for political reasons. He just says it almost straight up.
Yeah.
Right. He wants to create a political order, and he sees orthodoxy as a tool to create that political order. And so I'm not interested in that. Like, I don't find that particularly useful, and I don't think it's going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. So there's kind of I mean, I feel the same way. I feel somehow politics is not the right place to be at the moment, or somehow.
Well, politics is downline from what I'm talking about. It's down the road. I don't think there's a political solution to the crisis we're in. So I do believe that at least for yourself and for your family and for your immediate surrounding, that there is a spiritual solution, and that if we kind of go down that road, then it will have political fruits down the line. But you know, the martyrs of the early Christian church weren't thinking about. They didn't think that the Roman Empire was going to convert. I don't think they could even imagine that. But they didn't act for that. They didn't act towards they didn't organize their actions towards the conversion of Rome. They organized their actions to the glorification of the kingdom, and willing to.
So they didn't have martyrs. A 5-year plan or a
300-year
plan or something. In fact, no plan. The people who have no plan usually end up actually doing something, whereas when somebody puts a too heavy-handed a political plan in place, it always fails, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that you obviously need some planning like in your life, but I think that we need to be where we are. One of the things too that the internet has done is to make us all think that we're somehow political actors, that we're somehow so people get involved in things that they have no power over in any way, and they start ranting about it online, and I don't really see where they're going. Like, I don't see what the purpose is. And so I do it too sometimes. Like, I get sucked in. I usually, if you want to know, I tell people, like, if you want to know how I'm doing, just see what I'm writing on Twitter. If I'm writing about politics, it means that I'm not doing well. So you want to understand where I am in my life. So anyway, I think that really the solution is more of a spiritual one, or more of a Christian solution. And it won't be a political solution, maybe down the line very far, but at least for now, it's just about.
Well, that's what sort of what Jordan Peterson says too, even though he gets more political than you do, that he does say that you have to set your own the spiritual world straight before you, before you go out and do something in the world.
Yeah. And there's a deep traditional insight, which I think does have echo in many religions, this idea of that it's the anchor of reality is your heart. And if you transform that, then things will start to reverberate around you. That this quote from Saint Seraphim of Sarov, which is, acquire the spirit of peace and thousands around you will be saved. And it's the idea of become a saint. That's your role in life. If you become a saint, then things will change. They really will.
So you would disagree with John Vervaeke on that point, because he says you should become a saint without God, but I don't know if that's possible. But I feel. Let me say this.
I
love John. I think he's a fantastic guy.
I think John is awesome.
I kind of find myself in between you and John, like in terms of how I view things. Like, there's part of what John says which I think is right. And then I'm also sympathetic to your orthodoxy as well. So I feel like in between you and John and where I situate myself.
Yeah. But let's say there's a reality of, let's say, as someone who grew up Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And then you decided to turn against your own upbringing, let's say. So there can be reason to do that. And I understand.
In his case, it was sort of like abuse and thing,
Yes, exactly.
That happens a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's also that's the role. Like, let's say you could say it the same. It's like the West has been very abusive.
Yeah.
For the past several centuries, extremely abusive, but we need to deal with it. Like, we need to deal with it from inside, not deal with it, not try to abstract ourselves from our story and then say, the West has been abusive, therefore I don't identify as a Western anymore. Or this is what the whole woke thing is about. It's about noticing the abuses of the West.
Mm-hmm.
And then saying, I don't want to identify with that anymore, even though you're a Western person, even though you're a white person, all that stuff is there. And you're saying, I don't want to identify with that anymore. And you don't know how to do it. So you make all these weird gestures of self-flagellation or whatever, like all these stuff. So it's the same with Christianity. And this is our story. Like, most of us, we grew up Christian, like most of us. And so we have to deal with that.
Well, I think
we have to deal with it, like, in a real.
I didn't grow up as a Christian because I had 60s parents who were secular. Parents. So I think there's a lot of people like that too.
Yeah.
Who never grew up with like I of course I was exposed to Christianity here and there, but I didn't grow up in any kind of church or anything. So, but So wokeness is when the margin becomes the center. Is like.
Well, it's about, I mean, it really is about it's like an upside down weird hierarchy, and it's manifesting itself that way. And it's manifesting itself almost like a tyranny of the margin, you could say, even more than just a upside down hierarchy. And so a tyranny of the exception, the tyranny of the thing that doesn't have identity. And so it's the opposite of, it's like a weird opposite racism, which people already kind of see that it's like a mere reflection of all the things they dislike about, suppose that they say is evil about the West. It's like a dark mirror reflection of that. And it ends up looking like its enemy. And it's very disturbing. Yeah. So there's that's not definitely, I don't think that's definitely not a solution to the problem. Let's say to the meaning problem.
Yeah. Well, it also seems to be a caricature at this point, which might be a good thing because it seems so caricature-like that I guess not everyone is going to take it all that seriously. And
yeah, but you don't need.
I guess a lot of people are moving towards meaning and are fed up with postmodernism and the new atheists and
let's hope
this whole worldview is seems to be dying, and it seems to be that. I don't know. I was listening to the same rabbi was talking about how orthodoxy is now huge in Russia, Orthodox Judaism, and all these traditions are coming back again in powerful ways. So,
yeah, it's definitely a counterweight. I mean, what's happening in Russia is it's like you said, like we talked about the wheat and the tares. It's like a mix of really surprising and amazing, and scary at the same time. But there are definitely some really wonderful things happening in Russia. And there's let's say,
I mean, religion is permitted there, after the whole Soviet Union now, and people are becoming religious again, I guess.
Yeah, but it's like the motor. Religion, what's happening in Russia, it seems, is that although Orthodox Christians are still a minority in Russia in terms of being baptized, but they seem to be the motor. Like, they seem to be the forward movement, and they're the ones who are kind of driving change in culture. Whereas here it's the opposite, where it's like most, maybe not anymore, but until very recently, like more than 50% of the population would say that they're Christian, but the driving motor of culture was not that. It was the opposite of that. And so, yeah, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. What are tell us a bit about your projects, like the symbolic world, and where are you moving? Where are you going? What are you doing? Like, what are your plans for the future and that kind of thing?
I mean, so the thing that I'm really excited about now is to see, let's say, a whole bunch of people kind of come up inside this new space, this interesting space that is being created. It's hard to fully define yet, but there are some really fascinating people that are wanting to kind of discover symbolic thinking and also write about symbolism, or even create videos about symbolism.
Like J.P. Marcel, I've had great
J.P. Marcel
with him. He's a beautiful thinker.
And there are several others. Like there are quite a few. Alex Cortides, and there's a few. But for some reason, my mind isn't going to their names. But so there's a few people like that are kind of coming up. And so what I want is I'm redoing the whole Symbolic World website in the hopes that it'll be more like a space for this type of thinking on forums, but also blog posts, and being able to feature other people's content to create more of a kind of synergy in terms of movement. So that's like what I'm doing online. I obviously have the subject that I'm interested in. I'm trying to bring people back to kind of understanding the universal history of the way that medievals tended to perceive the way everything was interconnected in terms of history. Mm-hmm. And so there's like there's a lot of stuff going on in the background, which is slowly going to start to show. I'm starting a whole French version of the website, which if you want to write for that, you're very free to do so.
No, my French is not good enough, believe it or not.
It's not good enough.
No, not enough to write. I can speak it very well.
You can speak it all right. Anyway, so we're doing a whole French version with J.P. Marceau and Christian Roy and a few others. There's also a few other people that are kind of in that sphere. So that's the kind of stuff I'm doing. I want to also be more involved in French in Quebec, and so that's like my next. Let's say aim, and continue to be able to do icon carving, and I'm starting to hire people just because I need more time. Like I need time and space. So that's been kind of happening in the background as well, which has been great because it's kind of opening up some space for me to do the things I want to do. And so people have been amazing supporting what I'm doing. So it's like I want to try to make it as much as I can, to the glory of God, let's say.
Uh-huh. Okay, one last question. Where's your brother?
Yeah, go for it.
At? Where's your brother? Because I read his fantastic book, and then he did one interview, and then he's disappeared, and I'm curious about him, and because he's such a great writer, and
yeah. Well,
so where is he?
Where is he? He's on he kind of moved away from civilization, and he lives north of Montreal, a few hours north of Montreal, and he bought a little land, and he bought a yurt. And is wanting to do agriculture to kind of pull away from the system, let's say, as much as possible. But he still wants to write, and so he still wants to do things. I think he's just in a moment where he's kind of reorganizing his life, and so I think we'll see him again, at least in writing. He might not appear in videos again because he really. I mean, you never know, maybe, but he's the
introvert, I guess.
He's expressed a few times that he doesn't necessarily like that kind of attention, but he definitely will be writing again. And there's a project that I'm working on, which is this epic story that Mathieu, my brother, and I wrote 10 years ago, and we're kind of working on putting it out as a kind of graphic novel series about dog-headed Saint Christopher, and all these legends in scripture that no one wants to talk about, giants and dragons, and all the weird stuff in scripture that all the modern people want to avoid. And we're just jamming that up. We just jammed that all into one story, and so that'll be coming out probably, I don't know when. We hope this summer, but now it's looking like the fall we're going to start to put that out. So okay.
Anyway, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Jonathan. Thanks so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. It's good to talk to you.
Take care.
Right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.